Welcome back, everyone. Today we'll be taking a deep dive into a topic that's both complex and often shrouded in secrecy: the interplay of political Islam and Western powers.
And specifically, how this relationship has been marked by manipulation and exploitation.
Precisely. And to do that, we'll be drawing on a wide range of sources that span over a century of history, many of which are just now being declassified.
It's a dense and fascinating subject, one that demands a very careful examination.
Absolutely. So to start, I think it's crucial to understand how Western involvement, often motivated by self-interest, has played a role in the emergence of these militant Islamic movements and contributed to conflicts around the globe.
A great place to start is with the decline of the Ottoman Empire.
Right, that pivotal period really set the stage for so much of what followed.
It did. Our sources really emphasize how, during World War I, the British Empire made all these promises of independence to Arab leaders.
In exchange for their support against the Ottomans.
Exactly. But as we know, those promises turned out to be, well, empty.
And all of that is meticulously detailed in the Sykes-Picot Agreement.
Right, a secret pact between Britain and France that essentially carved up the Middle East between them.
And completely ignoring the aspirations of the Arab people in the process.
It was a blatant betrayal, one that sowed the seeds of deep resentment, setting the stage for future conflicts.
And adding fuel to that fire was the prevailing Western attitude of the time, often summed up as the white man's burden.
Which essentially held that Western interventionism was justified as some kind of a civilizing mission.
Further fueling the resentment that was already simmering among many people in the Arab world.
Absolutely. And it's in this historical context that we start to see the emergence of these militant Islamic movements.
With one of the earliest and most influential being the Muslim Brotherhood, founded in Egypt in the 1920s.
The Brotherhood advocated for the establishment of this pan-Islamic state, governed by Sharia law.
And they saw Western influence as the primary obstacle to achieving that vision.
And they embraced this concept of militant jihad, a concept that unfortunately would be later exploited by various actors for their own ends.
And a key figure who really exemplifies that exploitation is the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem.
During World War II, he actually formed an alliance with Nazi Germany.
A chilling example of how religious extremism can converge with political opportunism.
Absolutely. His alliance with the Nazis was driven by a shared hatred of Jews and a desire to expel them from Palestine.
And this dangerous ideology resonated with the Nazi regime, which saw a chance to exploit his influence to further their own goals.
His story really underscores the dangers of manipulating religious fervor for political gain.
Right. It's a stark reminder of how easily those lines between religious and ideological boundaries can blur when it comes to political manipulation.
And another key player that emerges in this story is the rise of Wahhabism in Saudi Arabia.
This incredibly strict, fundamentalist interpretation of Islam.
And it's crucial to remember that the rise of Wahhabism wasn't just some organic spread of religious ideas.
The United States, recognizing the strategic importance of Saudi Arabia with its vast oil reserves,
Formed this incredibly close alliance with the Saudi regime, effectively endorsing the spread of Wahhabi ideology.
and that was in large part as a counter to Soviet influence during the Cold War.
Exactly. So the Cold War, sadly, became this breeding ground for the manipulation of political Islam on an unprecedented scale.
And the CIA, determined to counter Soviet influence, began employing a strategy that was, in hindsight, incredibly risky, using extremism as a tool.
One of the most striking examples of this was the CIA's recruitment of former Nazi collaborators and Muslim Brotherhood figures.
These individuals, despite their, frankly, deeply troubling ideologies and histories, were seen as valuable assets in the fight against communism.
This short-sighted approach demonstrates how, time and again, the pursuit of geopolitical goals often overrides any ethical concerns.
And the ramifications of that strategy were significant and, in many cases, utterly disastrous.
The CIA's backing of the Mujahideen in Afghanistan against the Soviet Union is a prime example.
It was a pivotal event that, in many ways, laid the groundwork for the global jihadism we see today.
Exactly. And that's where we see figures like Osama bin Laden emerge, trained and funded by the U.S. to fight the Soviets.
Only to then turn those weapons against the West.
The unintended fallout from funneling money and weapons to these groups was enormous.
And these weren't just misguided policy decisions either.
No, key figures within the U.S. government, people like Zbigniew Brzezinski, a national security advisor at the time, openly advocated for destabilizing the Soviet Union's southern flank.
By manipulating Islamic populations.
His so-called Arc of Crisis strategy,
Which, as our sources reveal, was a calculated plan to exploit religious and ethnic tensions to further geopolitical goals.
And this manipulation wasn't limited to just Afghanistan.
The spread of jihad, fueled by Western involvement, quickly engulfed new conflict zones.
With the Bosnian War of the 1990s becoming a particularly tragic example.
It was a brutal conflict rooted in ethnic and religious tensions ripe for exploitation.
And the CIA, under the guise of providing humanitarian aid,
Actively supported Bosnian Muslims, drawing in foreign jihadist fighters, further destabilizing the region.
and that involvement in Bosnia set a dangerous precedent.
It showed that Western powers were willing to use political Islam as a means to an end.
Even if it meant fueling more violence and instability?
And this pattern of exploitation continued in the Kosovo War, with the emergence of the KLA, another group with a questionable human rights record.
Right. Despite knowing about the KLA's links to organized crime, the CIA provided them with training and support.
It's a stark reminder of the moral compromises made in the pursuit of these geopolitical goals.
The KLA's involvement in the Kosovo War really exemplifies this cynical use of political Islam.
The U.S., aiming to weaken Serbian influence,
Saw the KLA as a useful tool.
despite their unsavory reputation.
Exactly. And this manipulation of political Islam for strategic purposes isn't just some historical relic, by the way.
It continues to shape the geopolitical landscape today.
And a particularly fascinating case is Fethullah Gulen, the Turkish cleric, who emerged as a key player in what some believe to be a long game orchestrated by Western intelligence agencies.
Gulen's movement, with its seemingly moderate facade,
Gained substantial influence within Turkish society and its institutions.
which raised a lot of eyebrows about its true intentions.
Right, because while presenting this message of peace and interfaith dialogue,
The movement maintained these close ties to very powerful people within the CIA.
suggesting a much deeper strategic agenda.
His story forces us to really question to what extent Western powers are willing to go to manipulate and exploit religious sentiment for their own benefit.
And the Gulen movement's expansion beyond Turkey is where things get even more interesting,
They established this vast network of schools and businesses throughout Eurasia,
particularly in former Soviet republics.
which coincided with the U.S. efforts to counter Russian influence in the region.
All of this raises questions about the CIA's long-term strategy in utilizing political Islam to shape the geopolitical landscape.
So we see how this manipulation of political Islam is a complex and deeply disturbing narrative, one that continues to unfold in the 21st century,
From historical betrayals and cynical strategies,
to this relentless pursuit of power.
all of these actions have fueled conflict and instability across the globe.
We'll continue to delve into the devastating consequences of these actions in the next part of our deep dive.
The War on Terror, launched in the aftermath of the 9/11 attacks.
A global effort to eradicate terrorism.
On the surface, yes, but our sources paint a different picture.
They suggest the war on terror might have actually made things worse.
Particularly the U.S. invasion of Iraq.
A decision that destabilized the entire region.
The resulting chaos and power vacuum created a breeding ground for new forms of jihadism, even more extreme than before.
The rise of ISIS, for example, with their horrific acts of violence.
While ISIS's origins are complex, the U.S. invasion of Iraq undeniably played a significant role in their growth.
It's tragic irony, really.
Intended to combat terrorism, the invasion may have inadvertently helped create an even more formidable terrorist organization,
And this pattern of Western involvement in the Middle East.
often driven by a mix of strategic interests and what some might call misguided policies.
It's further highlighted by the events of the Arab Spring.
Initially holding the promise of democratic reform, the Arab Spring uprisings were quickly seen as an opportunity by Western powers.
To further their own geopolitical goals.
Exactly, under the guise of democracy promotion.
The U.S. intervened, often supporting groups that aligned with their interests.
Regardless of their actual commitment to democratic principles or human rights.
The consequences of this cynical manipulation, coupled with a lack of understanding of the region's complexities, were disastrous.
A prime example is Egypt. Initially, the U.S. supported the Muslim Brotherhood.
They saw them as a potential counterbalance to more radical elements.
But the Brotherhood's authoritarian tendencies and ties to extremist groups ultimately led to their downfall and the return of military rule.
It underscores the dangers of viewing political Islam through a simplistic lens.
It's not always a clear-cut case of moderates versus extremists. The reality is far more nuanced.
And Western attempts to manipulate this complex landscape, as we've seen, often backfire spectacularly,
The manipulation of political Islam is often interwoven with other objectives,
controlling vital resources.
securing strategic advantage.
The Chechen Wars offer a chilling example of this strategy in action.
A conflict fueled by a complex web of factors.
The region's long struggle for independence,
Ethnic tensions.
and of course control over valuable energy resources.
The involvement of foreign fighters and the rise of radical Islamic groups further complicate the picture,
Some of whom, as our sources indicate, receive support from Western intelligence agencies.
seeking to undermine Russian influence in the region.
The Chechen Wars highlight how Western powers, driven by their own strategic aims,
Often exploit existing conflicts, utilizing political Islam as a tool to destabilize regions and weaken rivals.
a strategy that ignores the potential long-term consequences of empowering extremist groups.
Groups that could eventually turn on their former sponsors.
And this brings us back to the unsettling case of Fethullah Gulen.
His movement's penetration into Turkish society
While maintaining close ties to powerful figures in the CIA
raises serious concerns about the nature of their relationship.
and the extent of Western involvement in manipulating political Islam.
The Gulen movement's expansion across Eurasia, particularly in former Soviet republics, coincided with U.S. strategic goals,
Countering Russian influence.
which has led some to speculate that the movement was being used by Western intelligence to advance their own agenda,
Their activities
establishing schools, businesses, media outlets.
provided a cloak of legitimacy while subtly promoting a specific brand of Islam aligned with Western interests.
This soft power approach aims to shape a region's political landscape without resorting to overt military intervention.
But it raises significant ethical questions
About manipulation and covert operations.
and the potential for blowback.
The Gulen movement serves as a stark warning.
The manipulation of political Islam isn't confined to the past.
It's still a potent tool in the 21st century
Used by various actors, including Western powers.
to further their own agendas.
The War on Terror, with its focus on Islamic extremism,
Provided a convenient justification for expanding Western influence in the Muslim world.
think of the invasion of Iraq,
The intervention in Libya.
or the support for various rebel groups in Syria,
These actions, presented as part of the global fight against terrorism,
have arguably served to further destabilize regions and empower the very forces they were meant to defeat.
And that's not all. The war on terror has also been used to legitimize controversial policies,
Like mass surveillance
extrajudicial killing.
and the indefinite detention of suspected terrorists.
These policies have eroded civil liberties, fueled anti-Western sentiment, and further complicated the fight against extremism.
The War on Terror has essentially created this atmosphere of fear and suspicion.
Blurring the lines between legitimate security concerns and the suppression of dissent.
The manipulation of political Islam, often disguised as combating terrorism,
Has morphed into this incredibly dangerous game, with profound consequences that are still shaping the geopolitical landscape.
It's been a really sobering journey so far. As we've seen, the manipulation of political Islam has been a persistent theme throughout history, and the consequences, as we've discussed, have been devastating.
Driven by strategic interests, by ideological agendas, by economic ambitions, this pursuit of geopolitical advantage has led Western powers down a very dangerous path, one that has frequently backfired, actually fueling the very forces they were trying to control.
The historical record is just littered with examples of how Western intervention, often framed as a civilizing mission or a fight against tyranny, has actually destabilized entire regions
Empowered extremist groups.
and undermined the very values that they claim to uphold.
It's a tragic irony.
And this exploitation of political Islam has been a particularly potent instrument in that pursuit of power.
Often leading to these unforeseen consequences that continue to plague the world today.
The rise of militant Islamic groups, the spread of these extremist ideologies, this seemingly endless cycle of violence in the Middle East and beyond, all of these can be traced back to these interventions.
It's a pattern that repeats itself.
From the broken promises of the Sykes-Picot Agreement to the disastrous invasion of Iraq, it's the same story. Western powers trying to reshape the world in their own image.
Often at the expense of those they claim to be liberating.
And the War on Terror, launched with such conviction after 9/11, has, in many ways, become a self-perpetuating cycle.
Creating more terrorists than it has eliminated.
The invasion of Iraq, the intervention in Libya, the support for various rebel groups in Syria, All of these actions, while presented as part of this global fight against extremism, have often served to further destabilize these regions.
And empower the very forces they were intended to defeat.
The use of drone strikes, extrajudicial killings, torture, all justified in the name of fighting terrorism. These tactics have alienated Muslim populations, eroded civil liberties.
And undermined the moral authority of the West.
They've created this climate of fear and suspicion, fueling resentment.
And that, unfortunately, provides fertile ground for these extremist ideologies to take root.
And as we've seen with the case of Fethullah Gulen, this manipulation of political Islam goes beyond just state-sponsored terrorism.
The Gulen movement, with its seemingly benign facade of education and interfaith dialogue, was able to gain access to the very heart of Turkish society.
And its institutions, which has raised serious concerns about the role of Western intelligence agencies
in potentially manipulating religious sentiment for geopolitical ends.
The Gulen movement's rapid expansion, especially in former Soviet republics, coincided with the U.S. goals of, countering Russian influence.
Which has led some to believe that the movement, despite its claims of promoting peace and tolerance, may have been used as a tool of Western soft power.
To influence the political landscape of these countries.
This soft power approach, as we've discussed, allows Western powers to exert influence and advance their interests in a less confrontational manner. But it also raises a whole host of ethical concerns.
About manipulation, about covert operations.
About the potential for these actions to backfire in the long run.
The Gulen movement serves as a stark reminder that this manipulation of political Islam is not something that belongs to the past. It's still very much a potent tool in the 21st century.
It's a complex issue, and I think the challenge now is to figure out how to break free from this cycle of manipulation and exploitation.
To recognize that the Muslim world is not monolithic.
To move away from these simplistic narratives of good versus evil.
And to engage with the Muslim world in a way that's more nuanced, more respectful.
It requires acknowledging the mistakes of the past, learning from them, and committing to a new path forward based on mutual respect, dialogue, and cooperation.
It means rejecting the cynical use of religion for political gain and really striving for genuine interfaith understanding.
So, I think the big question that we're left with is this. Given this long history of manipulating religion for geopolitical purposes,
can we actually achieve genuine interfaith dialogue and cooperation? Can we finally break free from this cycle of violence and distrust?
Those are questions that demand our attention.
And our critical thinking.
And a commitment to building a world that is more just and more peaceful.
As we wrap up our deep dive into this manipulation of political Islam, I encourage you to continue exploring these issues, to question the narratives that we're often presented with, and to really engage in meaningful dialogue with people from different faiths and backgrounds.
I think that's where it starts, with understanding, with empathy.
And a willingness to challenge the status quo.